as a being who in some way straddles the transcendental reality of the spirit and the temporal reality of the world, who participates in both the divinity of heaven while remaining in the world, as a bridge between heaven and earth. And I like what servant of God Archbishop Fulton Sheen said when he once characterized human existence. He said, we've got 1 foot in heaven and 1 foot on a banana skin. We are the ones who go and step on the banana skin, alright? And somehow we pray to avoid the banana skins. So we may live in the world, but we are spiritual creatures. Understanding ourselves as images of God has this consequence. If we deny God, we deny our spiritual nature. And if we deny our spiritual nature, we deny who we truly and authentically are. And so we reduce ourselves to a being whose existence is entirely circumscribed by and limited to this world. In other words, we just become another object in the world. So let's look at some of the alternatives. We'll just remember what a thing is determines how we treat it. So if human persons have no spiritual reality, well, why would we accord to them the profound dignity that's due to a spiritual creature? Well, there are 2 categories under which I'd like to present the alternatives to the Christian understanding. The first one sees man as the measure of all things. In a sense, man becomes the ultimate judge of all things. If there is no God, then there's no absolute, and we create our own values. Okay, so man is elevated. The other one seeks to submerge human dignity, submerge it down, to engulf it, to drown it beneath something which seems to have greater dignity. So let's look at the first one. Man is the measure of all things. I got this from an old sophist in ancient Greece. His name was Protagoras. When we pluck God out of the equation, if God is gone, if God means nothing to us, we deny the existence of God, we're totally indifferent to God, well, we may not realize it, but there's a big hole where God used to be. We create a vacuum. So who's going to fill the place of God? Well, according to some modern philosophers, man must replace God. We must recognize God as a fantasy, according to these people. If God is a fantasy, we must replace that fantasy. Because the fantasy is keeping us down. Christianity, to them, limits us, limits our potential. So, get rid of God. And what do we replace God with? Well, ourselves. Ourselves in the place of God. So we create our own values. We decide what is good and what is bad. And it's man who becomes God when he decides who lives and who dies. If we are the source of, if we are the ultimate judge of what is good and what is bad, well then, we are the ultimate judge of who lives and who dies. When we toss God aside, we think of ourselves as gods. Maybe not explicitly, but that's the way we act. But what this means in practice is the dehumanization of man. If we become gods, we lose our humanity. So look at the big events of the 20th century. Nazism, fascism, communism. Communism alone has left over 100 million people dead and counting. In the absence of God, it's man who decides who lives and who dies. And why stop at the ideologies? Why stop at the big political level? Let's look at the absence of God at the level of the individual. With good and evil now a matter of personal choice, there's a refusal to recognize the moral and spiritual order of life. Truth is what I want it to be. With the absence of God, there's a blindness to the spiritual reality of man. Blindness. What does Christ say about blindness? Well, let's look at Matthew 13. There are none so blind as those who will not see, none so deaf as those who refuse to listen. With the absence of God, well, we have no spiritual reality. If there's no God, we don't have any spiritual reality. we're just, like I said, objects in a world of objects. We just become commodities. So what do we do with commodities? Well, when we want a commodity, we consume it. So let's see, human beings as commodities to be consumed. Pornography, prostitution, sex trafficking, embryonic stem cell research, and so on. What do we do with commodities when we don't want them? Well, we get rid of them. Human beings to be gotten rid of. There's abortion, there's euthanasia, there's discarded frozen embryos, and so on. If man is the measure of all things, then there's nothing absolute about human life. If man is no longer the image of God, then we can reinvent what human life means. And that includes living as though life has no intrinsic meaning and persons have no intrinsic dignity. So, the other alternative. The first was the elevation of man. Now, the other is the subordination of man beneath something bigger. Well, over the last few hundred years, the moral foundations of society were profoundly pro-human. Judeo-Christian moral philosophy and secular humanism both promoted human flourishing and the protection of individual rights as primary purposes of society. But in recent years, we started to witness a rebellion against the view that ultimate moral value comes of being a member of the human race. So, last year in June, the Spanish government passed something called the Great Ape Project into law, declaring that chimpanzees, gorillas, orangutans are part of something called the community of equals with people. Why? Well, we share 95 to 99% of our genes with them. Therefore, in this understanding of what being human means, the small percentage differential between human beings and apes suggests that we are no more than our genes. If this is the case, then sure, if we're no more than our genes, then why not? The apes certainly do belong in the community of equals with us, if we're no more than our genes. So our genes become the ultimate reality. All right, okay, Richard Dawkins, the most famous atheist today, He's the big guy who asserts that we humans are merely the byproducts of our genes. It's all about the genes. Our genes use us for their own survival. We are nothing in ourselves. We are merely the vehicles that the genes use. Where's the human dignity or value there? Well, it's submerged beneath the genes. In the absence of God, man becomes absent too.